Welcome to this webinar organized by Peace Alliance Winnipeg. The idea for these series of webinars arose out of our annual general meeting held earlier this year, where we discussed Canada's foreign policy in very broad strokes and realized that to really get into Canadian foreign policy and to, I guess, alert Canadians as to the dangers of Canadian foreign policy and its actions internationally, we had to go more in depth on various issues. So today's webinar is a continuation of series of webinars. My name is Glenn Michalchuk. I'm chair of Peace Alliance Winnipeg. And this continuing series of webinars on Canadian foreign policy are to explain in depth Canada's actions in the world. The peace and anti-war movement in Canada is not just about wars and the militarism and intervention of other countries. Canada has its own aggression and interference abroad, and even takes the lead in some conflicts when acting in concert with the US and NATO. And today's subject is exactly an indication of how Canada leads and is very aggressive on these questions. Just before I introduce Maria, our speaker today, just a little bit about the format. Maria's talk will be approximately 30 to 40 minutes. And then after that, we'll have time for questions. I think the total allotted time for the webinar is an hour and a half. So we have plenty of time for questions. And when it's time for questions, just please use the raised hand symbol in your video, and you will be recognized. So without further, let me introduce María Páez Victor. Today, she discusses the hybrid warfare campaign that Canada and the United States are conducting against Venezuela. María Páez Victor is a sociologist born in Venezuela and educated in Caracas, New York, Mexico City, and Canada. For several years, she taught the sociology of health and medicine, as well as health and environmental policies at the University of Toronto. Maria has national and international experience in policy analysis and impact assessment, with expertise in the areas of health, environment, and energy. Now retired from teaching, Maria writes and is a frequent commentator on issues related to Latin American history and politics. She has participated in numerous events on TV, radio, and in public meetings. In addition, she has her own weekly radio program about Venezuela in the Spanish language community radio of Toronto. So without anything further, Maria, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate that you wanted to hear my scattered accounts. There is so much to talk about with respect to what is happening to Venezuela. I will try to give a summary of it. First of all, the coercive unilateral measures that are imposed on the people of Venezuela by the governments of the USA, by Canada, by the EU, and by England since December 2014 have caused massive and grave violations to their human rights, to their civil human rights, and to their social human rights, to their health, and to the everyday life of Venezuelans. This is amazing, but they have reduced by more than 90% government income by blocking Venezuela from producing and selling its oil. And it's impeded it from buying food and medicine internationally and blocked all its international banking. Venezuelan assets in other banks have been looted with impunity, including bank accounts, and most egregiously, it has taken over its oil company, Citgo, in the United States. Venezuela, in fact, was turned into a piñata, and everybody wanting to loot it. 40 European banks in 17 countries have stolen assets worth $6 billion. All in all, Venezuela has been deprived, due to these sanctions, this blockade and looting, of $350 billion. 350, I always get the numbers wrong. $350 billion. Now, this is enough funds to provide the entire population with food, medicine, and services for 26 years. It is 25 times the amount used to rebuild Europe after the Second World War bombings. Obama's decree in March 2015 declared the country an unusual and extraordinary threat to the security of the United States. Everyone kind of laughed at this. But in fact, it was a trick of their laws, which allowed him, Trump, and now Biden to carry out this hybrid war against Venezuela. This includes demonization through the media, economic warfare, including attack on its currency, a diplomatic war. No other country outside of all-out military war has thus been attacked. Not even Cuba, which has endured for 60 years, has been robbed to this scale. Venezuela is the 5th country in the world with the most sanctions against it. And you ask, what has Venezuela done to deserve this? Has it invaded a neighboring country? Has it declared war against another nation? Does it have weapons of mass destruction or even weapons 1/5 as lethal? Have any numerous or any mass graves been discovered there? Is it the leading narcotics provider, which it doesn't grow either poppies or coca? Does it produce or sell arms? Are unionists, journalists, and environmental leaders being assassinated there daily? Does it prevent women from holding office, to study, to work, to have control over their bodies? How about allowing women to drive, unlike friendly Saudi Arabia? Does it not hold often free elections, heavily monitored by international witnesses? Has it stolen any nation's assets or gold, unlike the USA, EU, and UK? Has it not a record of paying dutifully its international debts? Are the 120 plus non-aligned members of the UN denying it recognition and support? Well, the answer to all of these questions is no. Venezuela has been collectively and unjustly punished for defending their sovereignty, for protecting their own natural resources from rapacious and polluting international corporations, for defending their human, civil, and social rights, for refusing to bow down to the vicious power of the United States, Canada, and all its other supine allies. And throughout it all, Canada has followed the USA, burying any semblance of independence, any shade of national sovereignty in its foreign affairs, has slavishly participated in its lethal, piratical adventures of neocolonialism of the USA towards Latin America and beyond. Now, the interesting thing here is that Venezuela is winning this hybrid war. The outside world is amazed that Venezuela has not collapsed, that it is not a failed state, that its government and people have not caved in, that it hasn't disappeared into the Caribbean Sea, but you hardly hear of this by the media. But Venezuelans know that it has perdured because of its Bolivarian revolution, because of its robust participatory democracy, because of the multitude of communal councils, communes, and all sorts of popular collectives, all gathered around its government, facing the external enemy, defending, feeding, producing, and caring for themselves. But let's talk about the effects of this hybrid war. The first that I have to talk about is the media slander, vicious international demonization of the Venezuelan government and President Maduro, who was legitimately elected in fair and transparent elections. This is the big lie, that it is not a democracy and that Maduro is a dictator. Shameful, prostituted mainstream media repeats this ad nauseum, as well as politicians in the North. And you rarely hear any good news about Venezuela anyway. I mean, even when they're talking about music or something cultural, anything like that, they always have to put the little poisonous dart there against Venezuela. There have been, since the beginning of the Bolivarian revolution and government in 21 years, more than 25 electoral processes, presidential, for government, for governors, for mayors, for parliamentary deputies. No other democracy in the world has had this electoral record. And the electoral process is the best in the world, testified by huge number of international observers and indeed by the former US President Jimmy Carter, who's now an expert on international electoral processes. So I want to make an emphasis here. The violent attacks against the Venezuelan people are both systematic and generalized. All attempts at overthrowing the legitimate government is an attack against the rights of Venezuelans to govern themselves. And this is a right concentrated as far back as 1648 with the Westphalia Treaty that cemented the inalienable rights of nations. That is, that nations are sovereign and that they have the right of self-determination, and other countries should not interfere in their domestic affairs. This is the cornerstone of international law even today. And the attack on the Venezuelan nation is, in fact, threatens all nations vis-a-vis the power of the USA. The hybrid war is now a blueprint for domination. Can you show here diagram number 5, Graham? This is a diagram that gives you a bird's eye view or panorama of all the attempted coups and invasions, terrorist attacks, foreign, here they are. Now it's in Spanish. I don't expect you to read this. I just want you to look at the length and the breadth of this. And these are only starting from 2014. You can see here attempted coups, invasions, terrorist attacks, foreign funded street violence, paramilitary incursions, criminal gangs co-opted for terrorist attacks, targeted assassinations of Chavistas, assassination attempts against the president, cyber attacks to the electricity grill, sabotages to the oil industry, raids on the agriculturalist and the food supply. Now, Venezuelans lost their lives and many were injured in all of these attacks, and not one of these attacks was condemned by Canada or the USA or EU or any media. When the cyber attack left the entire country without electricity for 5 days, there was not a word of condemnation. Now, here in Canada, we often have a power a stoppage. You know, there's a storm or something, and for a few hours, there's no power, and everybody starts calling each other in a panic because for a couple of, maybe an hour or a few minutes, we didn't have power. Imagine 5 days without electricity. Nor when Nicolás Maduro became the first head of state to suffer an attempted assassination with drones in 2018. And this was on TV, the cameras, everybody saw this. No mention of this in the press with condemnation. These are not sanctions, but a blockade, just like the medieval war tactics that would surround a city until its people either gave up or died. Now let's look at the economic effects. This is the devastating weapon against the nation, with 3 main weapons. One, the economic war, the attack on PDVSA, oil being, of course, the main income generating source for the state. This is amazing. The Venezuelan state lost 90% of its government revenue. The second was the attack on the currency through the institution of dollar today, of the international credit agencies, of the IMF and the World Bank. And the third was stopping Venezuela from international trade, from using the international system of accounts and banks. This has impeded all buying of food, medicine, and essential infrastructure goods that were needed for repair. The stealing of Venezuela's fertilizing plant monomeros in Colombia resulted in a terrible fall in agricultural production. And the Bank of England, well, the Bank of England has been especially vicious. It would not even trade the gold for vaccines by giving it to the World Health Organization, as Venezuela pleaded. It has stolen 31 tons of Venezuelan gold in its vaults, worth well over $1 billion. That's $1,000 million. And further, to damage the country, the Bank of England intended to hand it over to the false Trump puppet alternative, the supposed President Guaido, this piece of garbage, because I can't think of a word to talk about him. And they stated that the bank did not recognize President Maduro, as if the bank had any jurisdiction or any kind of authority to do that. which is ridiculous. If they picked up the phone and called the palace in Venezuela, it would not be Guaido answering that. Guaido could not even get the obedience of one policeman or one fireman or anyone in Venezuela. He was a nothing. This is a huge red alarm warning to other countries, even capitalist countries, even Canada, that they too can be at the mercy of a bank such as this. But the most horrible of all of this is the loss of life. In 1 year alone, 2017 to 18, 40,000 Venezuelans died. And this is an estimate by a think tank in the United States. Today, that figure is 100,000. This includes chronically ill patients, people with diabetes, with HIV, with cancer, people who needed operations. These were not possible for the lack of medical supplies. And one very sinister consequence of the looting of Venezuela to other nations is it means that the very principle of ownership, so crucial to capitalism, which they tout up and down, is in fact being assaulted by the greed of power-hungry nations and the banks. Another sinister consequence to other nations is that it is all illegal, against the supposed rule of law. How many times do we hear our politicians go on about we respect the rule of law and all this garbage? Well, all of this is against the international principles and laws. This means that it's a dog eat dog in the international field. It's your sheer brute power that counts, not the rights of individuals or states. This is an all-out neoliberal assault on nations' rights in favor of the banks, of the financial system, of the military power of the US and its allies. Professor Michael Hudson states that the banks and financial entities embodied in Wall Street and Bay Street are what landlords were in feudal times, and he calls them the techno-neo-feudalist lords. Here is a diagram of the effects of the blockade. If you could put slide number 6, Graham. Here is, again, a bird's eye view of all the measures and consequences of this blockade, how it has affected the workings of Venezuelan life, even the COVID response, oil, fuel, seizure of assets, etc. Well, in total, it's been 192 individuals and 150 Venezuelan companies have been sanctioned. But I want to point out just 2. The companies that supply water pumps and water supplies cannot do so because it can't buy the pieces that it needs in the international market. And what this has done is that it's endangered the right to clean water to the Venezuelan population. I'm sure you all know how utterly and absolutely essential clean water is for a population. Well, that has been impacted by that. The second one that I want to underline is that more than half of the transnational pharmaceutical companies left Venezuela. It was 15 of them, 15 subsidiaries of these companies. These are the people that have patented medicine. These are medicines that can't be produced. They have the intellectual, ownership of them. And so we can't produce them and we can't buy them. So what does this mean? Diabetics can't get insulin. Those with glaucoma can't get essential eye drops. Those with AIDS can't get the viral serums. Many operations have been impossible and people have died without the supplies, the medical supplies that hospitals need. And because of the lack of medicine, the UN human rights expert, Dr. Alfred de Sayas, has stated that more than 100,000 Venezuelans have died directly due to the US legal sanctions. And during the pandemic, this is horrible. During the pandemic, on March 18th, the beginning of the pandemic, 2020, the IMF denied Venezuela a $5 billion loan that it asked for exclusively to buy medicine and medical equipment. That's all it wanted. Venezuela was entitled to ask for this loan, yet in the midst of a pandemic, the IMF inhumanely denied this aid. Here it is, the ridiculous pretext that it was unclear who was governing Venezuela. This is not only absurd, but cruel. Since the coercive measures against Venezuela are systematic and generalized, 3 UN rapporteurs have demanded they immediately cease because they violate human rights of the Venezuelan population. They are crimes against humanity. If you read chapter 32, article 32 of the UN Charter, the Vienna Declaration, and I'm going to read it out because it's really important that people know this. It says, I quote, "No state may use or encourage the use of sanctions, political or any other type of measures to coerce another state in order to obtain from it the subordination of the exercise of its sovereign rights." And now I want to read Article 7 of the International Criminal Court, which states, and I quote, "Crimes against humanity means acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directly against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack." So you see, these are not sanctions of the UN, but an illegal blockade. A unilateral, arbitrary, illegal, inhumane. In other words, it's war with just another name. We violate many other parts of the OAS Charter of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they violate basic rules and regulations of the international banking and commerce. So what are the implications? First of all, the erosion of the international judicial order, its authority, its respect, its execution that appears to be one-sided and arbitrary in favor of the powerful nations. There is and will be a movement by other countries to disconnect, to disengage, to ignore the biased judicial international institutions and attempt to build alternative or other one, more balanced ones in order to bolster the UN non-aligned group of nations. This is happening now. If these international courts are so biased, well, they're going to have to pay for this because they might be rendered superficial. Canada and many of its leaders are now exposed to be someday dragged to the International Criminal Court as perpetrators of crimes against humanity, especially in the construction of the Lima Group and the backing of a bogus Venezuelan government to try to oust the legitimate government of Venezuela. It failed, but nevertheless they tried. Canada's reputation in Latin America is at an all-time low. I just want to give you one example. The many protests in Haiti against Canada, not against Venezuela, against Canada, my own experience. I've lived in Canada for 40 years, but because of my family, I've always visited Venezuela every year to visit my family. And when I say to people that I live in Canada, I'm almost congratulated, patted on the back. People say, "Oh, you live in Canada, how wonderful. Tell us about Canada." Well, that doesn't happen anymore. Now people say to me, "Oh, that's terrible. You know, how can you stand living there?" This is what people tell me. This is how can I say, just my own little experience. But in general, I would tell you that the reputation of Canada in Latin America is at an all-time low. It is seen even below the USA because it's seen as a slapdog. The ugly Canadian is despised more than the ugly American because of its subservience. Now, why? Why all of this? Why is this happening to Venezuela? Well, first of all, oil. Venezuela has 25% of the world's fossil fuels. That's enough oil. I think it's something like 300,000 million barrels. It's enough oil for the next 54 years, which I hope we don't have to take out of the ground because of climate change. But nevertheless, the estimate is that it's enough oil for the next 54 years. So in terms of placing, Venezuela is first, then Saudi Arabia, then Canada, then Iran, then Iraq, and the US is a poor place 12. Second reason is gold. The Orinoco Basin has an arch which they have delimitated. And in just one single area of the Orinoco Basin, area number 4, there is a proven amount of 8,000 tons of gold, making Venezuela the country with the second largest amount of proven gold reserves. Now, this is of greatest importance to Canada. In terms of oil, Venezuela is Canada's rival because the petroleum that they both produce is very similar, in fact. They're rivals for the same market. But however, Canada is the mining capital of the world. All the major mining companies, corporations in the world have headquarters here. And the gold mining industry, Mr. Barrick Gold, I'm sure you all know, are a very powerful lobby in Ottawa. They have the key to all the corridors of power. And this lobby has been pushing for the ouster of the Venezuelan government because it wants its hands on that gold. The Canadian mining companies have an appalling trajectory of violently abusing human rights of indigenous communities, of rural communities, and of destroying nilly-willy their environments with impunity, and backed by Canadian lawyers and courts, which they sue them here and they always lose. Another important factor is that it has been suspected for some time that China may ditch the dollar at some point and peg its currency to gold. Now, if this happens, then Venezuelan gold will become a most sought after mineral. Secondly, but it's not really second, it's up there with equal with the importance of Venezuela's riches, is the threat of a bad example. It is the rebellion, the effrontery, the audacity of Venezuelan people to want to govern themselves, to want to elect a government of their choosing with disregard to the wishes of Washington. It's the outrageous attempt by a country to govern themselves and to want a socialist government. This is the problem of a bad example. At this point, I want to plug a book by two of my very good friends, Joe Emmesberger and Justin Perdue. They have written an entire book based on this extraordinary threat. It has just come out and it's terrific. Extraordinary threat, the US empire, the media, and 20 years of coup attempts against Venezuela. That's Joe Emmesberger and Justin Perdue. And now, with greatest love, respect, and admiration and gratitude towards Cuba, I believe that Venezuela is a greater threat than Cuba ever was, because the Bolivarian Revolution came to power peacefully through elections, through a democratic process, and is immensely rich with a strategic geopolitical location. And if it happens in Venezuela in this way, well, socialism might happen in any of the other countries, and it is happening. Castillo in Peru is the latest win for the region. Nicaragua, Bolivia, soon to be Chile, soon to Argentina, soon to be Lula in Brazil, and AMLO in Mexico. This is what they consider a threat. Now, the rapacious financial capitalism which we live under right now, it's no friend of real democracy. You know, it solidifies monopolies. It is this rentier capitalism that doesn't produce goods and services as the old capitalism did. You know, it does financial deals. It's money making money with the banks and Wall Street and Bay Street. And these are the leading actors to whom the capitalist nations are beholden to. In the pandemic, just to give you an example, in the pandemic, intellectual rights became so important. It became more important than saving people's lives, impeding the production and the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines in the South. We would still be suffering polio and smallpox if intellectual rights had been asserted in the past. Venezuela was unable to access any of the USA or European vaccines, but thankfully, China, Russia, as well as Cuba stepped up to provide them. This is true international solidarity. And it has been only in this last week, few days, that COVAX finally released the vaccines that Venezuela had paid for. And they would not release either the vaccines or give us back the money. So the assault on Venezuela is a sinister Machiavellian assault on nations' rights. The USA wants only governments that are compliant to them, not their own population. And it erodes as much as it can, and especially through lawfare, the rights of individuals and nations in favor of corporations, of financial capitalism. Now, what are the implications for Canada? There has been not one single Canadian editorial in support of Venezuela and all that it has done to raise its people out of poverty, nor about the numerous attacks to terrorize and overthrow its legitimate government. And they have actually created the ridiculous Lima group to specifically overthrow the government of Venezuela. And I am so happy to tell you all that it is now dead. The Canadian media has no journalist on site in Venezuela. It relies almost entirely on US media outlets, on US spokesperson, even on US academics for its news and comments on Venezuela. The CBC seems a pitiful arm of Fox and CNN News. And now I want to end with the latest wonderful news, which is ignored and unreported. The amazing triumph of President Maduro, a man who has called 1,000 times has called for peace with the opposition. It is an amazing triumph of Maduro, the government, and especially constitution, that the negotiations in Mexico, for the first time, serious peace talks are taking place with only Latin Americans, without the US, only Venezuelans negotiating, with the government on one side and a series of opposition parties on the other, including representatives of Guaido's party. The host is Mexico, and the mediators are Holland, Denmark, and Russia. First of all, before they even sat down, they all signed a memorandum of understanding, recognizing the government of Venezuela, its president, and its constitution, renouncing violence and accepting the coming elections in November. This is huge. The second thing is that the opposition dropped their previous stance of, we will not sit at the table unless Maduro goes. This, of course, is anti-constitutional. They can't do that. So they have just finished the first round, and this is what they have signed to. Two major decisions: renouncing the sanctions of the blockade, and the opposition saying that they will do everything to try to stop it. Remember, they were the ones who requested it. These anti-patriotic people and anti-democratic people who are now sitting on that table were the ones who went to the United States and begged on bended knee that sanctions be applied to their own country, and were even going around begging for military invasion of Venezuela. So now they're all quiet. No, we didn't really mean that. And we will go, that is very good. This is very good. Thank goodness they say they're going to try and stop this. And the second is, unlike what they had put on the table, that they were going to give the Essequibo to Chevron. Essequibo is a large part of Venezuelan territory towards Guyana, right? And so they are supporting Venezuela's claim to the Essequibo, which the Guaido wanted to give to Chevron. So the war against Venezuela, insofar as Canada is concerned, its demonization, its undermining of Venezuela will continue as long as Canadians continue with their blindness with respect to their federal government that has become a branch plant of the White House. Canada must shake its colonial mentality. It should dare to be itself, to embrace its uniqueness, grounded very much on its indigenous peoples that it has treated so badly. Its sterling multiculturalism that respects and enjoys cultural differences, and its traditions of hardiness, resiliency, solidarity, which helped build this nation in a very severe geographical situation. But for this, we need politicians of a kind we don't have. Intelligent, audacious humanists who will put the economy second to the welfare and future of its people, who will consider Canada as integral part of the subcontinent of what we call La Patria Grande, the big homeland, the great homeland south of the Rio Grande, who will not bend to the bully next door in detriment to them. Canada can have a different, sustainable, humane future if its elites would only let it, and transform its political culture into a less elitist, more participatory and democratic one, and become a much more better neighbor to the nation south of it, to the south of it in its hemisphere. And one last thing I want to say, when you're studying Canadian foreign policy, study that ministry, that ministry is like a little fiefdom. It's one of the most sinister and secretive and unresponsive sections of the Canadian government. They do what they want, and the Canadian people know nothing of the foreign policy that they are doing. So many times when I speak about Venezuela to intelligent people, educated people, I say, what's happening? He said, oh, I never heard of that. I didn't know we were going to do this. I never heard of the Lima Group. That is a cornerstone for changing Venezuela, Canada's foreign policy. We have got to redo, rethink, tear down, and build up a different foreign affairs ministry. And I end here, and I hope that you have, questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for a really excellent and profound presentation that really brought forward a lot of information about Venezuela and the various actors who are engaged in trying to destabilize Venezuela. So we now have time for questions. I would ask you to raise your hand in your window, and then we'll recognize you and Paul will unmute you. Is there any questions to Maria to begin with? Oh, Nino, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Maria, every time I listen to you, I get stirred up. I wish I could give you a hug right now. I mean, I'm really, really excited. As a Venezuelan to a Venezuelan, I just love you. I mean, for your passion and your knowledge, your understanding, and the way you explain things, and you provide all this valuable information. I'm so excited right now.
Thank you.
Anyway, I'm trying to, formulate in my mind some ideas that are coming out. I think the most immediate idea that comes, of course, it's on the political aspect. I mean, what you are pointing out when you refer to Canada, that Canada is an imperialist country. And this is not rhetoric. I'm not trying to demonize Canada in this case. I'm just talking about exactly what you refer. When you look at Canadian politics, Canadian foreign policy towards Venezuela. And then if you extend that to some of the countries that you also mentioned, I think what we see is a policy that Canada has been developing, especially in the last few years, of imperialism. This is capitalism on testosterone. Okay, and this is what's happening now, and that's what we've seen in Venezuela for the reasons that you just explained. Mining. That is what Canada is after, and this is what Canada wants from Venezuela, and this is going to be going on for a while. So, politically speaking, that's what Canada is using to frame its own its own foreign policy. But speaking of foreign policy, that you referred about it, changing the Ministry of Foreign Policy in Canada. There's one typical example that just happened a few days ago. In the middle of elections in Canada, we have 5 major political parties that have had a live debate on TV. The topic that was excluded from that debate was foreign policy. Mm-hmm. It's outrageous. That really stirred me up too, because I was enraged when I heard that. I even wrote something about it, because how is it possible? How do you educate Canadians on foreign policy, which is the most important aspect of any government, is foreign policy? And when you link foreign policy, to domestic policy, the privilege that we have in Canada today, all of us, including immigrants like myself, but I speak as a Canadian now, is precisely that the privilege we have, it's all as a result of the bloody foreign policy that Canada has towards other countries. That's where our privilege comes from. So let's not bask in our, virtues and our, wealth and privilege. That's where it comes from. And that we have to recognize. But no Canadian cannot know about it because the major parties will not speak about it. Why? They all agree on that. They have a consensus of what Canadian foreign policy has to be. So what to debate about? They don't have any debate on it. Now, the debate would come if they introduced the socialist countries that we also have in Canada. Those are small countries, small parties, and yet they have something to say about foreign policy, but that does not happen. And that is something that we as Canadians, we have to look after. So you've brought that up, but I also want to be maybe a little more cautious about the, when you mentioned the dialogue happening in Mexico. Of course, that is a success, total success of Maduro, who has been speaking since day one, including Chavez, about having a dialogue with the opposition, okay? So now we have it, finally, and yet we still hear the US threatening with sanctions. If this dialogue doesn't go in the way we want, we will enforce more sanctions against Venezuela. And this is something, it is absurd. Now, I say this because, there's been attempts of dialogue before with the opposition. And how they ended up? They didn't happen. And they didn't, really materialize. And so I have a word of caution, and maybe you can comment on this too. What you see from your sources, that this dialogue will actually become a success story, especially in view of the election. So if the opposition will participate in the elections, we will really see what Venezuelans actually want from their leaders, from Maduro and from the PSUV and etc. So sorry for my extension, but thank you, Maria. I love you.
Well, Nino, I love you back, okay? Because you're always so profound in your in everything that you write and say, and I really appreciate your kind words. And I agree with everything that you say about imperialist Canada. I feel, I feel, this is a terrible thing, I'm a Canadian too, but I feel sorry for Canada because I wrote an article about Europeanism here. It went from wanting very much to be part of the British Empire, and it fell into out of the fire into the into the other fire. Forget the thing. And then it wanted to be part of the US empire. This is what's happening. And so it has been imperialist towards its own indigenous peoples. Look, the horror of the residential schools is just like mind-boggling. And of course, it tries to be imperialist with respect to the lesser countries in South America. All of you little brown people down there have to listen to us too. So it's an imperialist point of view that is very much amongst, and I have to say this, the elites of Canada, which is a bit broader than the government. We have in Canada a very elitist government, and I can tell you this even more elitist than the US. And we have got to break that door into Ottawa. This is what has to happen, that we cannot allow these elites that, where do they send their children to school? They send them to Harvard. They send them to prep schools in the United States. Where do they go on vacation? They all go en masse to that pitiful place in Florida. I mean, look at it broader and you will see these elites. They think it's the same thing, the United States and them, oh, poor deluded. This is like the United States, the England saying that they have a special relationship with the United States. This is a joke of the first order. Canada also has this joke that they're the same, and they're not. They're not. They don't even realize that Canada is one of the most colonialized countries. We have been colonialized by the United States. They have infiltrated Canadian government and Canadian society. I mean, this is really unbelievable. I get a newspaper, a Toronto newspaper, and every Sunday inside it is the New York Times. I didn't ask for it. There it is, you know. Where does the news come from about Venezuela in Canada? It all comes from US companies, news companies. So this is the first thing we have to do, give consciousness to Canadians what is going on. With respect to the foreign policy, well, first of all, this wasn't a debate. These five supposed leaders of the parties. First of all, it was an event organized by the media. This was not an event organized by political figures, by the government, by the parties. No, it was the media. They are calling this is how we're going to do it. And what does the media want? The media wants confrontation. The media wants something, you know, really sexy for people to be talking about. Oh, yes, he hit the other one with this wonderful thing. They're all based on sound bites. What it should have been is a series of serious interviews of every one of those leaders so that the Canadians can realize what's in their heads. So to me, this wasn't a debate. It was just a media soundbite, if you like, a ridiculeness of debates. And I was like you, incensed. I sent off these emails everywhere when I realized that they weren't going to talk about foreign policy. But you know why? It's true, they all agree, but it's also because foreign affairs does not want that discussed. I am sure there was great pressure. I'm sorry if I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I believe that the government did not want foreign affairs to be talked about because they didn't want anyone to bring up Haiti and Canada. They didn't want anyone to bring up the Lima Group with all its criminals in it and its failure. They didn't want anyone to bring up Canada's role in the Afghanistan war in there. So I'm sure the Liberals said, no way, we're going to talk on this. Again, I come back to the issue that this ministry is the most unresponsive, the most unparticipatory, sinister, and full of mystery for the Canadian people. And now with respect to the negotiations in Mexico, oh yeah, we know what 2 times the opposition has kicked the table and walked out of the negotiation. What is different now? We got nowhere to go. They have hit rock bottom. It isn't, they call it the unitary something or other. They are not united. They are all fighting with each other in a terrible way. The emails that they send between each other are barbarous. They hate each other, okay? And they cannot come together towards unitary measures. Now, from being coup people, now they all want to be a candidate. They all want to go to these elections. So the news is that 70% of Venezuelans are angry at the opposition for the sanctions, and they blame the opposition and not the government for what's happened to their economy. And this is shown in data analysis, all these polls over and over again, even the polls of those who don't support the government. So they've hit rock bottom. Now they realize if we're going to be elected, we've got to say we're not with the sanctions, that we have changed. And of course, the other thing that has happened is that Guaido is a fool and a thief who's run away with money. Even the USAID is saying, where's our money? He and his cohorts just, the criminals, the common criminals who ran off with the money that the US gave them. You know what? I think if the Venezuelan justice doesn't get Guaido, the Americans are going to get him for being a thief. So I am more optimistic about this. And I hope that they stand for election and that they go down in flames, which is why in my little magic ball, am looking at the future. I think that that's what's going to happen to them. Thank you, Nino, for your wonderful questions.
Are there other questions to Maria? Actually, I have just a comment and a question, but I won't if someone else has one at this point. You mentioned, both you and Nino mentioned about the debates not including Canadian foreign policy. And that's a real Achilles heel for a lot of the mainstream political parliamentary parties in Canada, because none of them have progressive stands on Canadian foreign policy. And they would really be exposed and fleshed out if their stands would have to be discussed in terms of a debate. The question I have is there possibilities, like realistic possibilities, of hosting people-to-people exchanges with Venezuela? And in particular, I'm thinking the possibilities with Indigenous peoples. I know there's been attempts to have those, Canadians travel to Venezuela, and they often haven't worked for various reasons, partly because of blockade, partly because of sanctions and difficulties the Americans throw up in hosting those things. But what are the realistic possibilities of perhaps bringing Venezuelan delegations to Canada? That's my question.
Okay, Glenn, just a month before the pandemic occurred, I was privileged to be invited to Venezuela to the first international meeting of the indigenous peoples of Latin America. And I went as part of a Canadian delegation of indigenous peoples, where I would be translator and sort of facilitator for them. So I arrived in Caracas, and I walk into the venue, and as I come in, these people come up to me who are organizing and said, "Are you the one from Canada?" And I said, yes, I am. Show me where the indigenous peoples of Canada are. Well, guess what? It was me. The other indigenous peoples from Canada did not go. And so I had to say to them, hold on a minute. I am not an indigenous person from Canada. I cannot represent Canada. I was just here as a facilitator. Don't put me down as I am representing the Canadian. Imagine if it got back to the indigenous people of Canada that I was down there representing them. So that was terrible, because the people from Canada who were able to go were not able to, because of the problems of travel. They had to take certain certain routes in order to get around everything, and so that was impossible for them to arrive. It was very sad, because I certainly stayed and enjoyed and learned so much from all the indigenous peoples of Latin America who were there, and just blew my mind to hear them all speak about their great concerns. But I want to tell you, you want something that really threatens the Canadian government? You unite the indigenous peoples. You unite the indigenous peoples of Canada, who are all divided by this ridiculous laws and regulations that has divided them one from the others. This is, it's a nightmare, what the legal regulations between the indigenous peoples. The whole fact that they wouldn't recognize their traditional leaders and had to do, democratic elections. And that was just to put in their stooges in there, who they would then give them money and do whatever they want. So I tell you, the first step that indigenous peoples have to do is just take hold of the laws that govern them here and change them according to how it would be if it respected their own nation as such, as individual nations. The second thing that would be tremendously threatening to the government is the union of the indigenous peoples of Canada with the indigenous peoples of Latin America. And I can tell you, they are very revolutionary, even if they don't say it is. They are all up in arms because they are all suffering basically the same kind of oppression. And the other thing that impressed me at this meeting was that they're not going to take it. one after the other says, you know, we've had 500 years of this rubbish, we're not taking it anymore. So anyone who wants to work for the unity of Indigenous peoples here in Canada and the unity of Indigenous peoples in Canada with their brothers and sisters to the south, I tell you, all power to them, because that would really rock this country, and would rock this country in a good way, not in a bad way. I'm not talking about, you know, doing bad things. I'm talking about making Canada itself, its own personality, its own history, its own world. You can't do that unless you include the Indigenous, your original peoples that can no longer be marginal. They have got to share in Canadian prosperity, but also they have to share in the conduction of this country's future. They have to have a role in that. Not let's, oh, you little people, come here, let me give you some things so that you shut up and be quiet. So I totally agree with your idea that we should try this. But I want to tell you another thing, that Canada blocks any kind of people we've invited here in Toronto. We've invited a whole bunch of people from Venezuela, and the visas are not given. It is very hard to get visas. You will have to go around that, have somebody, maybe universities invite them or something like that, because they're vicious right now. The Canadian restrictions for people, my sister wanted to come, an older lady wanted to come and visit me. I had to get my parliamentary deputy here where I live in the riding to help me to get her to come and visit me. So it's very hard right now.
Well, thank you. No, but no, that's very helpful. And I think there's been some discussion in the Peace Alliance. We're a very small organization, but there is an interest to try and do this.
Good.
To actually bring some Venezuelan Indigenous people to Canada. And maybe you've given us some ideas how to work on that. Is there other questions to Maria? I'm just looking at the screen. I don't see any hands up at this point. Oh, I do. Carol Mowat, thank you.
Okay.
Carol, unmute. Or Paul, unmute Carol, yes.
Got it. Hi. As one of those people who didn't make it down to Venezuela to join you there.
Yes, Carol was one of the people trying to get there and was blocked.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, I kind of expected it though, you know, the way things were going. But I thank you for your very good presentation, and also for the information from the Orinoco Tribune and others that you offered for us to read. I was reading Yves Engler's and the others, and I noticed one of the things that you mentioned in as a statement with regard to the book by Podur and Embersberger, I think.
yes.
And you're saying that there's an erosion of democratic principles, that this situation in Venezuela with you know, the attacks of the US and of Canada and others on Venezuela, the hybrid war, that it indicates an erosion of democratic principles. I would ask you to enlarge upon that. I mean, more than you already have done.
Well, Carol, I guess this is the huge stone, this erosion of democratic principles. They are, I think they're more frightened of Venezuelan democracy than they are of Venezuelan socialism. Because democracy means that it is the people who freely are and critically thinking and freely taking decisions. Capitalist countries don't want this. Capitalism is against democracy. It always has been. It has always been a question of how can we dominate the powers of the state? How can we make the state be always on the side of our interest? So every now and again, the United States has to find a smaller country and kick it around to show that, you know, they're the number one, that they're the hegemony, that they can, especially in Latin America. How dare you little brown people think that you can get around us? They have been doing this to us since our independence, okay? So they are afraid of Latin American democracy. This is why I said that the Venezuelan experience is more a danger to them than the Cuban one. And I don't mean this and criticize my beloved Cuba, whom I love, okay? But Cuba became a socialist, or I would say a communist country through blood. I mean, they had a civil war in Cuba, right? Times have changed. That was in the 1950s, right? And now here we are in the year 1999, Hugo Chavez comes to power and democratically. And then at the very next election, he declares, if you vote for me, you vote for Venezuelan socialism, because socialism is the only way. There's no middle way. And he got a landslide. That was the beginning of Venezuelan socialism. The United States alarms went out everywhere. We got to get rid of this man. We got to get rid of Venezuela. We have to crush Venezuela. This is what they wanted to do, because they will not have socialism in their backyard. This is why they crushed the Sandinistas. This is why they're still after Nicaragua. This is why they're still after Cuba. And this is why they want to crush Venezuela. And the danger is that socialism came to Venezuela. You know, Venezuela is not quite a socialist country right now. It is on the way to socialism because, you know, and especially after everything that's happened, it's in a flux. But the hopes, the ideas, the objectives of the government, of the PSUV, of the people, is that we're going to create a socialist country here. And that is the big threat. And this is why Justin Podur at Emmitsburg have written this book called The Extraordinary Threat. It's more than just the fact that Venezuela is very rich. It is the fact that it is rebellious and saying to the United States, the hell with you, we are us. We are going to determine who our government is, and neither you nor any other country, not Canada, not the EU, not the UK, is going to tell Venezuelans how they're going to govern each other. And if they make mistakes, it'll be their own mistakes. I hate it when they go on about, oh, Maduro has made these economic mistakes. The hell with it. Huh? What country hasn't made economic mistakes? Huh? But it will be our mistakes, and not because the United States has pushed us into a corner. So yes, the attack on Venezuela means that the United States can do the same thing to any other country. And Canadians, excuse me, but it can also do it to us. Just think of all those trade things to do with the lumber and to do with the salmon and all of that. We always lose, huh? And look at what this woman Freeland did in these NAFTA negotiations. Threw our dairy farmers under the bus in order to please whom? Reprobate Trump, because they were all afraid. Mr. Trudeau was afraid of Trump. It didn't matter that Trump insulted him any which way. Oh no, we have to lick their boots. So Canada, you may think you're an imperial country. You may want to play with the imperial big people, but Canada is also vulnerable and should not sit on its laurels thinking it has a special relationship with the United States, because that will go right out the window when they come for our water. When they come for our riches, when they come for our salmon, when they come for all the mining riches that Canada has. So yes, the attack on Venezuela should be a warning to any other country that wishes to be independent.
Are there any other questions or comments? Joe, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to say thanks so much, Maria. You're very generous to mention our book. Yeah, I'd like to comment. There's a trap, Western, people like us, leftists who live in the empire, fall into this trap of being hypercritical of governments that are under siege from the US and its allies. Recent examples is a really ridiculous letter signed by some prominent leftists attacking Nicaragua. Yeah, so I just want to say that, Maria made a great point. You consider Evo Morales, give us a really good example, a country whose economy was managed flawlessly, really, given all the constraints, and he was overthrown anyways. So people come down on Maduro or anybody else, but there's never a perfect government, and there'll always be ways to nitpick. But we can't fall into the trap of basically, I hate to say it, becoming useful idiots for U.S. aggression. So I just wanted to make that point. And thank you, Maria, again.
Joe, I'm so glad you said that. I didn't want to be too, let's say, controversial here. But I despise so many leftists, especially some here in Canada, who are so, holier than thou, holding up their book of socialist or Marxist principles and saying, oh, what's happening in Venezuela is not a real revolution. It's not a real, and go ask the Venezuelan people. Huh? Don't look at your books. Go ask Venezuelan people what their life was before the Bolivarian revolution and now. They say, oh, well, they only eat meat, once a week. Well, before the Bolivarian revolution, there was no meat to be had for the poor. They were out on the street begging. I mean, really, one of the great things that the Bolivarian Revolution has done is to lift these people out of poverty. The misiones, the achievements of the Bolivarian Revolution are amazing. Now, of course, right now, we have tremendous problem because of the sanctions, but nevertheless, people aren't starving on the streets because the government has put as its main objective, keeping those funds and that medical service going. I don't care about anything else. Let everything else fall to pieces, but we must continue to take care of our people. This is admirable. This is not austerity, which would have seen right here in no time. Oh, our GDP has gone down. We need austerity. We have to cut this. We have to cut that. At least in Venezuela, if anything's cut, people know that it's to do to the United States. So these leftists, they blow hot and cold with respect to Venezuela. And most of them have never been there. And most of them have no intent to try to understand that it is a different culture, a different political culture. And, Marx would be the first to say, revolutions are not done by a book. They are done through the struggle of classes. And it is the classes, and in this case, the proletariat and the capitalists, whatever. And you never know what's going to come out of that clash, how that is going to evolve. He made a very dynamic view of how societies change. And I hate these supposed leftists who use his books and books such as his from the left as if they were some sort of Bible come down from the mountain. It is the people of Venezuela who are taking decisions day in and day out, just like the Cubans are, day in and day out, following their own drum. And so long as they have their good goals in their mind, they will get there through different methods. Cuba will get there in its way. Nicaragua will get there in its way. Venezuela will get there in its way. But I would say all roads lead to Rome, to our socialist Rome that we have in our minds. And I really, quite frankly, despise those that criticize Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua. And I would say this, that is the flaw of the left, because you never find right-wingers criticizing the right-wing governments. You don't get right-wingers, criticizing Colombia. You don't get the right-wing criticizing the likes of Trump. You don't get these right-wingers criticizing Ukraine, okay? They are solid in their horribleness. And we have got to stop doing this. Those of us have to realize that we have to be on the side of the angels, and we should not be fighting each other.
I see Nino would like to speak again, but before I go to Nino for a second time, is there anyone for a first time who would like to raise a question to Maria or a comment to Maria? Yeah, and we'll recognize Nino. And before, I think it's on Marx's grave, the very comment you said, Maria, that various philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it. That's not an exact quote, but that's to the.
I agree with you. I agree totally.
Yeah, Nino.
Yeah, thanks again. I'll be shorter this time. But I think on the point of the left, Maria, it's so true. Often I say that, you know, on the left, we always speak of solidarity, union, and so on and so forth. But you know what? The right wing, as you just said, you know, they have more solidarity among themselves than we have on the left. Okay, I was talking to somebody from Italy just yesterday, and they said in Italy they have 5 communist parties, 5 different communist parties in Italy. Okay, so that's that. But you know, but I think I wanted to add something. When we talk about Venezuela and we extend that to the Patria Grande, as you mentioned, yeah, we always refer to socialism. And the political aspect of you know, what's going on. But let's not forget that there is a strong, deep-rooted historical foundation that's, you know, supporting all this political, the political issues we're talking about. Now, I'm saying this to you, who you are a historian, you know so much about history, but, you know, I never forget, in fact, you know, the importance of history. Chavez, you know, founded socialism in the 21st century based on Bolivar, based on Venezuelan history, and he promoted, you know, the Bolivarian socialism, you know, on those roots. What unites Latin America, unites the Patria Grande to a certain extent, even the Caribbean countries, you know, is in fact the historical roots that we all have. And that's where it's founded. Now, that's a very dangerous, you know, issue for countries like Canada or like the United States, where the historical roots are very weak. And that's my personal opinion. So I think we have to recognize that Bolivarian revolution, that's the key word, Bolivarian. Chavez chose that not by accident and not by rhetoric. He chose it because he believed in that. And we, in Latin America, we believe in that. We do have that strong root, and we are believers that that is at the basis, at the foundation of our revolution. And it has to be at the foundation of the Patria Grande. CELAC, ALBA, they're all based on that. Then that's the strength of those international Latin American and Caribbean organizations. So I don't know, I mean, I'm saying this to you again, but you know all about this. And I think I just thought that maybe it should be mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Nino, for bringing that up. I want to remind people that when Obama met Chavez at a meeting that the heads of state were having in Trinidad, and I can't remember the year, but it must have been 2016 or 2015. Chavez gave him as a present the book, The Open Veins of Latin America. Seminal book, okay, really important, telling the horrors of the conquista and the colonization. And at one point, Obama, this was his speech, okay? He's been given a history book, and his speech to us included, we should forget about history, because people said, you know, we have a history of of descent with the United States. We should forget about history and only think about the future. Well, this went down like a bomb everywhere in Latin America, okay? Forget about history? Listen, you scratch a Latin American and out of that vein comes out history. History is our leitmotif, you know. We would be nothing without our beloved history, especially in Venezuela. Now, let me come back to the Marxists. Bolivar, of course, was born before Marxist ever wrote, okay? So he was not a Marxist, but he knew his people and he knew what governments needed to do. And so, of course, his idea of anti-imperialism lives on, and his idea of integration lives on, his idea of participation. You know, all the others who tried to make a coup against the Spaniards failed because it was these white people trying to do it. He was the one who said, no, we want to get rid of foreign domination. We have to be all of us, you know, the white, the black, the slaves that have run away, the slaves that have been freed, the cimarrones, the pardos, all the different, it was a very caste type of societies. And he brought them all into his movement and his army. And this is why he was able to liberate 5 nations, okay? This idea, which of course live in right now in all of us. His idea of Pan-Americanism, he wanted to build an organization in Panama. He considered the center of the continent where we would all sit. So he's talking about a United Nations. This man was amazing, okay? This is why we call our movement Bolivarianism. As you well said, Nino, everything that you have said is so absolutely true. So there were the 2 things that many people who were on the left I'm going to talk now about Latin America, but I could also talk about other countries, were imbued with European ideas of Marxism. They could think nothing but the Russian model, the Chinese model. They could not think of a Venezuelan model. Enter the genius of Chavez. His genius was that he knew his people. And his genius was that, no, we have to build our model, and our model has to be built on our history. When he declared his election campaign like the campaign of the Batalla de Santa Inés, the Battle of Santa Inés, which is a huge battle in Venezuela, he was telling people about their history. When he talked about the things that have happened in our history and made them real right now in our political struggle. This was huge. All of a sudden, the ordinary Venezuelan people were not asked to relate or unite to some strange European ideas of Lenin and Marx and Engels and you know, the czars and Mao. All of a sudden they were told, we've done this. We've done this before. This is our history. And this is what we're going to do going forward. He won all the elections because he rooted in this is what I'm telling about Canadians who should do and learn about their own history. He rooted in their own history. The other aspect of our people, whether you like it or not, our people are very spiritual. And so that cold materialism, anti-clericalism, anti-religious aspect of the Marxists who wanted to transform Venezuela in the past could not have a root in Venezuelan people. And along comes Chavez and said, no, this is fine. This is fine. We can be Catholics. We can be evangelicals. We can believe in Maria Leonza. We can believe in all the cosmologies of our indigenous peoples who had never been recognized their religion. And Chavez said, this is fine. We can all work together. There's no impediment here. And that was the greatness of the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, rooted in our culture, rooted in our history, rooted in our cosmologies. And that is why we will win. We will win. There's not going back, because as it's not the governments, it is the people who do their own revolution. And this is what we are at right now. It doesn't matter what the United States does. Doesn't matter what the Europeans think. Doesn't matter what Canada thinks or does. Venezuela, and I may say, the Patria Grande has learned a great deal, and it's not going to take it anymore. And we've got a very good future ahead.
Thank you, Maria. I think that's as good a way as any to bring this webinar to an end. We have reached our, no one go away yet. We have reached our time limit. And again, very, very good presentation, very, very good discussion too. So, and I'll just ask Paul to give us information as to this event. This webinar has been recorded, and where we can find that information subsequent to the webinar.
Thanks, Glenn. Subsequent to the webinar, very soon, I hope, the video will be available on our website, which is peacealliancewinnipeg.ca. That's one word, peacealliancewinnipeg.ca. So sometime in the next 24 hours, you'll be able to find it there.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thank you for everyone who participated. Thank you, Maria, for your presentation. And with that, we'll say goodbye to everyone, and hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you very much.